The rain fell softly that morning as black umbrellas lined the cemetery like silent witnesses. A billionaire's funeral is never small. Luxury cars, expensive suits, polished shoes, stepping carefully over wet grass. But grief doesn't care about money, and even the richest man in the city stood broken beside the casket. Inside lay his daughter, or so everyone believed. The priest had just begun to speak when a sudden voice cut through the silence. "Stop! Heads turned! Heads turned!" Whispers rippled through the crowd. At the edge of the cemetery stood a garbage collector, mud on his boots, uniform faded, breath uneven. He didn't belong there. Two guards moved toward him, annoyed. But the man shouted again, louder this time, his voice shaking with urgency. She's not dead! The billionaire froze!" The crowd laughed nervously. Some shook their heads. Grief makes people crazy, they thought. A poor man disturbing a sacred moment. But the garbage collector wasn't joking. "I see her every morning," he said, stepping forward despite the guards. "I saw her last night. She was breathing." The billionaire's heart skipped, his fists clenched. "What are you saying?" he demanded. The man swallowed hard. 3 nights ago, while I was working near the hospital dumpsters, I heard crying. Weak! Almost gone. I followed the sound. The cemetery went silent. Oh, there she was. Your daughter. On a stretcher marked deceased, but her fingers moved. Her chest rose slowly, barely, but it did. Gasps spread through the crowd. I begged the nurses, the man continued. They told me to go away. They said she was gone. But I've buried enough things to know the difference between silence and death. The billionaire's knees trembled. Doctors were called back. The casket was opened. And then, a faint breath. A miracle. She was alive. Tears streamed down faces that moments ago were filled with judgment. The billionaire collapsed, sobbing, not from loss, but from realization. The man everyone ignored, the voice everyone mocked, the truth everyone dismissed, saved his daughter. Later that day, as the sun broke through the clouds, the billionaire stood before the garbage collector. "I have money," he said quietly. "I have power. But today, you had something I didn't." The man looked confused. "You listened," the billionaire continued. "You noticed. You cared." The garbage collector smiled softly. Sir," he said, sometimes the world throws away what still has life in it." They laughed at him before they listened. That's how it always starts when a voice doesn't sound important enough. When it doesn't wear the right clothes or stand in the right place. The garbage collector knew that look well. The half smile, the sideways glance, the quiet assumption that whatever he was about to say could not possibly matter. He had seen it every day of his life. People only noticed him when the trash piled up, never when he spoke. As he stood at the edge of the cemetery, rain soaking through his thin uniform, he felt that same familiar weight pressing down on his chest. Not fear. He was used to that. But the knowledge that truth often has to fight just to be heard. Around him were men who ran companies, women who managed fortunes, guards trained to remove problems like him without thinking twice. In their eyes, he was just another interruption. But the thing about unheard voices is this. They often carry the clearest truth. He didn't have medical degrees framed on a wall. He didn't have influence or connections. What he had was attention. While others rushed through their lives, protected by titles and authority, he moved slowly through the forgotten corners of the city. He noticed what people left behind. He noticed what they stopped caring about. And sometimes he noticed life where others had already written death. When he said, "She's not dead," it wasn't bravery that pushed the words out. It was responsibility. He had seen too much discarded too soon. Furniture thrown away. Because of a broken leg. What's a broken leg? Food wasted because of a small bruise. People ignored because they were inconvenient. And now, a human life labeled finished simply because it was easier to close the file than to look again. The crowd didn't want to hear him because listening would mean admitting they might be wrong. That the system could fail. That wealth and expertise did not guarantee wisdom. It was more comfortable to believe the poor man was confused than to question the finality of death already announced. Unheard voices threatened comfort. They disturbed certainty. The billionaire himself almost turned away. Grief makes authority fragile, and the last thing he wanted was false hope from someone who had no place in his world. But something in the man's voice, steady, not desperate, cut through the noise. It wasn't begging. It wasn't attention seeking. It was conviction born from seeing something real and refusing to pretend otherwise. That is the danger of ignoring unheard voices. They don't shout for recognition. They speak because silence would be wrong. The garbage collector didn't stop the funeral because he wanted praise. He stopped it because he knew what it meant to be invisible. He knew what it felt like when no one believed you, when your truth bounced off walls built by status and assumptions. And he refused to let that same invisibility bury someone alive. In that moment, power shifted, not because money changed hands, but because attention changed direction. People leaned in, faces hardened with doubt softened into uncertainty. For the first time, they weren't looking at the man's uniform. They were listening to his words. Unheard voices don't lack value. They lack listeners. When the casket was opened and breath was found where death had been declared, the lesson became impossible to ignore. Expertise had failed. Authority had rushed. And the truth had waited patiently in the mouth of someone no one thought mattered. The billionaire would later replay that moment again and again. Not the miracle itself, but the realization that nearly cost him everything. He almost dismissed the only person who was right. Not because the man was wrong, but because he was small in the eyes of the world. That day rewrote a rule no one admits they follow. That importance determines truth. It exposed how often society confuses loudness with accuracy, credentials with awareness, wealth with wisdom. And it showed how survival sometimes depends on listening downward instead of upward. Unheard voices are often closest to reality because they live where reality is raw. They see cracks others step over. They notice details others are trained to ignore. And when they speak, it is not for recognition, but because ignoring what they know would be a greater crime than being dismissed. The garbage collector didn't just save a life that day. He exposed a dangerous habit. The habit of assuming truth must come from the top. And in doing so, he reminded everyone standing in that rain-soaked cemetery of something simple and uncomfortable. Sometimes the most important voice in the room is the one no one planned to hear. At first, everyone accepted it as final. The word dead has a weight that presses down on questions, silences doubts, and shuts doors in the mind. Once it is spoken, people move on to arrangements, rituals, and closure. No one wants to linger in uncertainty when pain is already heavy. So they trusted the label, the paperwork, the signatures that said the story was over. Loss, they believed, had already won. But life does not always leave loudly. Sometimes it fades so quietly that it is mistaken for absence. A shallow breath, a weak pulse, a flicker of movement, things easy to miss when the world is in a hurry to conclude. What looks finished from a distance can still be fighting when no one is close enough to notice. The hospital had done what it always did. Procedures were followed, forms were filled, conclusions were drawn. Efficiency replaced patience. In rooms filled with machines and schedules, there was no space for hesitation. Once the decision was made, it rolled forward without pause, carrying a human being along with it. Loss was recorded, but life had not yet let go. The mistake wasn't cruelty, it was certainty. People trusted systems more than sensations, reports more than instincts. When experts agree, questioning feels disrespectful. And so, life was misread as silence, weakness mistaken for the end. This is how life is often lost, not through violence, but through assumptions. The garbage collector did not see death because he wasn't looking for it. He wasn't trained to confirm endings. He was used to discovering what remained. Working among discarded things teaches a different kind of vision. A different kind of vision. You learn that broken doesn't always mean useless, that stillness doesn't always mean gone, that something can appear finished while holding on to one last chance. When he heard the faint sound near the dumpsters, he didn't dismiss it as imagination. He paused. He listened again. The world tells people like him to keep moving, to finish the route, to not ask questions. But something inside him refused to accept that the sound meant nothing. That pause, that single moment of attention, stood between life and loss. Everyone else had already moved on to mourning. He stayed in the space between. The funeral represented that final step society takes when it believes there is nothing left to save. Flowers replace questions. Speeches replace checking again. Closure becomes more important than accuracy. It comforts the living even if it risks abandoning the truth. That is the danger when life is mistaken for loss. Endings feel cleaner than uncertainty. It is easier to grieve than to hope, easier to bury than to wait. Hope demands patience. It demands the courage to admit we might be wrong. The billionaire had accepted the loss because he trusted the certainty of others. Money had taught him that professionals handle things, that systems exist to prevent mistakes. But systems are built by people, and people are tired, rushed, and sometimes blind to quiet details. Wealth can buy the best care, but it cannot guarantee careful attention. When the casket was stopped and opened, reality interrupted belief. The breath they felt was not loud or dramatic. It was fragile, barely there. Life did not announce itself, it whispered, and in that whisper was a truth that shattered assumptions. It wasn't over yet. That moment forced everyone to confront how often they confuse stillness with emptiness. How many dreams are buried because they slowed down? How many people are counted out because they no longer perform loudly enough to be noticed? How many relationships are declared dead because communication weakened, not disappeared? Life rarely ends in one clear moment. More often, it lingers at the edge, waiting to be recognized. The girl's survival was not just a miracle of the body. It was a reminder of perception. It revealed how easily humans surrender to conclusions, how quickly they accept loss without re-examining what might still be alive beneath the surface. What looked like an ending was only a pause. And in that pause, one person's refusal to accept the obvious rewrote the story. It proved that life does not always need strength to continue. It needs someone willing to believe it hasn't finished speaking yet. No one expected compassion to be the thing that changed everything. Money was everywhere that day, expensive flowers, polished cars, tailored suits. But none of it had the power to stop what was about to happen. Wealth created the scene, authority organized it, and tradition prepared to seal it. Yet none of those could recognize what compassion saw immediately. A life still holding on. Compassion begins where convenience ends. It requires stopping when the world tells you to keep moving, caring when caring brings trouble. The garbage collector had nothing to gain by speaking up. In fact, he had everything to lose. His job, his dignity, even his safety. Interrupting a billionaire's funeral was not bravery born of confidence. It was courage born of concern. He acted not because it was safe, but because it was right. Most people feel compassion. Few act on it. Few act on it. Feeling is quiet and private. Action is public and risky. Compassion that saves lives is the kind that steps forward anyway, even when it will be misunderstood. The man could have walked away that night by the dumpsters. He could have told himself it wasn't his business, that someone else would handle it, that the system knew better, that his voice didn't matter. That is where lives are lost, at the moment someone chooses comfort over care. He did it. He listened again. He watched closely. He questioned what others had already accepted. Compassion sharpened his awareness. It made him notice the slight rise of a chest, the fragile movement of fingers, the sound too soft for a busy world to hear. Where others saw a task completed, he saw responsibility unfinished. Compassion does not need expertise. It needs presence and need expertise. At the funeral, the same compassion pushed him forward. He stood before power without anger or arrogance. He didn't accuse. He insisted. Not for recognition, not for reward, but because a human life outweighed the embarrassment of being wrong. That is the true cost of compassion. The willingness to look foolish if it means someone else survives. The crowd's reaction showed how rare that kind of compassion is. People step back, not because they didn't care, but because caring openly makes you vulnerable. It exposes you to judgment. It forces you to challenge authority. It disrupts order. Compassion is inconvenient, and that is why it is so powerful. When the truth was revealed, shame washed over the faces that had doubted him. But shame was not the lesson. Humility was. The billionaire realized that all his resources had failed to do what one compassionate act accomplished. His wealth could buy machines, but it could not buy attention. It could fund hospitals, but it could not guarantee someone would truly look. Compassion filled the gap where money and systems stopped. Saving a life is rarely about heroic strength. More often, it is about refusing to look away. The garbage collector did not lift rubble or perform miracles. He simply cared long enough to question what others had accepted. That care interrupted a chain of events that would have ended in tragedy. Compassion is not loud. It does not announce itself. It whispers. It checks again. It asks, what if we're wrong? It insists this still matters. That day proved that compassion does not belong to a class, a title, or a paycheck. It belongs to anyone willing to see another human being as more than a task, a problem, or a conclusion. It reminded everyone present that systems exist to serve life, not replace care. That procedures without compassion can become dangerous. That efficiency without humanity can bury hope. The girl lived because someone cared enough to interrupt the inevitable. And the world shifted, just slightly, because one man chose compassion over silence. Not because he was powerful, but because he was present. Not because he was trained, but because he was human. In the end, it wasn't money that saved a life. It was the simple, radical act of caring when it would have been easier not to.